Hello, hello. I think we'll get going. So, welcome. I'm Mark Haine. I am one of these people who wears multiple hats. I have a small specialist consultancy looking at various matters of digital identity, particularly in the engineering direction. I am a member of the OpenID Foundation, and I'm also a member of the Open Identity Exchange. And the inspiration for this presentation has been a piece of work that Elizabeth and I have been doing together to write a white paper that helps government stakeholders grasp, tackle, or whatever, all of the, maybe not all, but as many of the challenges around delivering digital identity as we can help them with. In particular, the kind of human-centric side of things.
And I'm Elizabeth Garber. I also have quite a few hats that I wear. I was a co-founder of a small identity startup called IDPartner. And I'm really excited that you're in the room here today because you looked at an agenda and you said citizen-centric identity, that's for me. And that means you are my people, our people, and we're really happy that you're in here. My background originally was more of so I actually started in neuroscience, in market research, via psychology. And my passion is really to try and design solutions and systems and products that do good in the world and that leverage human-centric principles in order to do good. And that's why I got involved in this industry once I realized it existed a few years ago. And it's what drove me to get involved in this particular paper, because it speaks to so many of the issues and challenges, and it's a real opportunity to have an impact. The first thing that we would like to do, given that you looked and you saw citizen-centric identity and thought that's for me, we want to change the title. We want to change the title from citizen-centric identity to human-centric identity, because part of the journey that we have been on is learning how the framing citizen-centric identity leaves out a lot of people, and we're going to talk more to that in a second. So by show of hands, who here has heard of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the UN? Most people. Oh, maybe that was a generous most, but a lot of people have heard of it. So after World War II, there was a lot of soul searching going on, and nations around the world gathered to try and identify what are the fundamental rights of being human, what rights need to be guaranteed and upheld wherever we are in the world. And Article 6 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is this: everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. Everyone has a right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. And if you want to learn more about the Universal Declaration, you can visit the UN's website, and there's a lovely illustrated guide here. And this right to recognition is so fundamentally important, not only in and of itself, but because it upholds so many of our other human rights that have been codified either in that Universal Declaration or in all the other subsequent covenants that the UN has developed. So things like the right to education. When you enroll in a school, you need an ID. The right to leave, the right to travel, the right to leave your country and then return to it later if you so choose. The right to start a family, the right to health care, the right to a safety net, the right to vote, the right to privacy. That in some way depends on being seen as an individual, doesn't it? So all of these human rights that have been codified all relate in some way, and many more do, to identity. And that's what really drives the UN, which is seeking by 2030, and Lucy knows all about this. This is what's driving the UN to try and ensure that all human beings on the planet have access to a legal form of identity everywhere. And we assert in the paper that identity systems should be designed to sustain and promote these human rights. We're going to talk a lot about this. And we also had a discussion, didn't we, Mark, about whether the word should be should or must, because as standards people, that word can be heavily laden.
It matters.
So we've agreed, and it's a strong should. So that's what we'll be using here. Now, how are we doing on that? So how are we doing in the context where, where we are now, Nevada, 42 million Americans were victims of identity theft in 2021. More than a third of us say that we have been victims of identity theft at some point. I'm not trying to cast aspersions, but is that evidence of our rights being upheld? The UN Office on Drugs and Crime, they speak to 1 to 3% of GDP is represented by illicit flows of money. And when we stop for a second to dig beneath the surface of that number, what does it actually mean? It means the drugs trade and all of the effects on humans that has. It means the arms trade. It means human trafficking. It means the destruction of natural resources and the redirection of resources from local communities to others, and the destruction of our environment. 850 million people or more lack any form of ID. That's according to the World Bank's latest figures. That number used to be 1 billion. It seems to have gone down, but there are also some real questions about how accurate even this is. 10 million people or more were considered stateless in 2019. So that means that they lack access to a state that will issue them with any kind of ID.
Actually, a few months back, we met a lady at a conference, and she kindly arranged a session with us over Zoom with some stateless people. And my goodness, that was enlightening. Going back to the slide earlier that was talking about recognition, it was really clear from our conversations with them that without any form of recognized ID or stateness, they were really, really inhibited in most parts of their life. They couldn't travel, they couldn't get education, they couldn't get access to any sort of benefits. They were really in a very, very unfortunate situation. And I think in part this also comes back to the change of title of this session a little. Citizen-focused makes it focused on nations, and these stateless people are not represented by nations. So that's why we wanted to shift the title into human-centric.
Absolutely. It's so important to remember that people who are not citizens have needs in relation to government ID systems as well as people who are citizens.
Yeah.
It's also important to remember effectively stateless people, right? So 38% of the world's population live in countries that the Human Freedom Index denotes as not free. So what does that mean? I mean, that's a huge number, right? But it means that in those countries, there are large populations of people who can't really be assured that their government is looking out for them and protecting and upholding their rights. And that was an interesting part of the conversation that Mark and I had with these people, because some of them were stateless. Some of them were in areas outside of their home country where they couldn't get access to an ID. And for them, it was really critical. We need an ID. They had some preferences about who issued it, but almost having the ID was more important than anything. Whereas those people that we spoke to who are actually in Afghanistan or in Myanmar, they had a different feeling, didn't they? The tone of their feedback was more, yes, ID is important, but I'm kind of afraid of how the government's going to use that ID. So both of them had, it sounds on the surface like they're a very similar population, but they're actually quite different. And then, so those are some of the areas where identity helps us to solve problems, but then it's also inextricably linked to some of our emerging challenges and questions, especially in relation to how emerging technologies affect how we need to think about human rights today. So we live in a world where we have increasing capacity to identify individuals, track their biometrics, and that's being used by private entities in ways that we haven't necessarily thought through. We have situations where, whether or not you know you're interacting with an AI, they probably know a lot about you and might be able to influence your behavior, whether that is in relation to your voting behavior or ending your marriage, as the Sydney chatbot tried to do. Or many, many others. I think there's also a story that I should have stuck on here about ChatGPT being able to fool a CAPTCHA. Identity is really inextricably linked to all of these concepts. And when we're thinking about designing digital identity systems, understanding how technology is changing the nature of human rights is really, really important. And that's where legal identity meets digital identity, right? That's where all the efforts around the world to build digital identity systems comes together. So McKinsey talks about the boon that digital identity is, how it unlocks 3 to 13% of economic value depending on where you are in the world, and how we really need to do this and roll out these systems immediately. And then on the other hand, you've got organizations who are saying, whoa, 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 hang on, are we ready for this? Have we thought about the institutional frameworks that we need to make sure that we're doing this in a safe, rights-preserving, rights-enhancing manner?
Yeah, in some respects, are we ready to take that economic benefit and risk some consequences that maybe haven't played out yet, right?
That's right. So we're adapting that earlier slide, and we're saying digital identity systems as well, strong should be designed to sustain and promote human rights. So let's double click on both of those scenarios, both the benefits and the risks. So digital identity is amazing, and it can solve many, many problems. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this news story from, I think, 2017. This is Patricia Brown, and this is a story from the Washington Post. So this woman, she fell on hard times. Her mother had passed away. She was living with her mother, and she got evicted from her apartment. But this occurred at a time when she was out at the grocery store, and she returned to her home in Washington, D.C., and found all of her belongings strewn about the street, and any form of physical identification that she had was gone, long gone. So she's a citizen, and she's not stateless, but she has no proof and no way of reestablishing those credentials that she had previously had. And as a woman who's already being evicted, she may not have the resources in time and money that it's going to take to reestablish that identity. So digital identity, especially like a biometrically linked digital identity, could be, a game changer for people in this situation, right? They can be recognized and quickly reestablish themselves. And there are many other benefits to governments and to societies that governments serve potentially. So there's safety and security benefits. There's benefits to political stability if we can, reduce misinformation. There's access to government resources and the simplification and the building of efficiencies and the rollout of aid and other benefits and resources. And then economic stability. The Bank for International Settlements and others in the financial sector write frequently, FATF, on how important identity is, and identification and digital identity, for reducing the illicit flows of money that really undermine our financial system.
So quicker, cheaper, better.
Quicker, cheaper, better. Yeah, there's so many benefits to digital ID. But that is not the whole story. And there are many well-intended programs out there funded by people with the very best of intentions, right? The World Bank, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, creating digital identity solutions and rolling them out. Now, it's very important to also look at the experiences, the reported lived experiences of people on the ground. This was actually presented at EIC, if any of you were there, by Hank Marsman, who's supporting us on this paper. And he shared this report about the digital identity system in Uganda, which in 2021, about a third of the population still lacked the National Identity Card, the NIC. But at that time, the Ugandan authorities made it essential for accessing resources and accessing healthcare. And so in the case of this woman here, she was pregnant, she was sick, she needed urgent emergency healthcare treatment, but because she did not have an identity card, she was turned away at the hospital, left to die. And she thought she was going to die until she, found a nurse who saw reason. I don't know whether that nurse was in or out of the hospital, but helped her. We also have the case of Okie, who he was undocumented at the point that the identity system was rolled out. He had no proof of exactly how old he was. And instead of taking his word for it, they put him through a number of tests. They interviewed him. They asked him about, what events took place in his lifetime. And the state determined that he was 10 years younger than he actually was. And what does that mean for him? It means that he needs to work and live and survive an extra 10 years before he can access the benefits intended for him. And so as we are designing, as we are implementing, as we are rolling out digital identity solutions, we need to ensure that we're upholding human rights at every stage. There are, of course, many more examples around the world, and I think it behooves us to think about populations in Myanmar. This population has historically, many different identity systems have come and gone that have disenfranchised this group of people. The Rohingya population, they've been denied access to ID, they've been miscategorized in order to treat them as foreigners and possibly even relocate them. And today, there's a big movement in the Rohingya population to turn down access to identity documents because of how they've been mistreated. And that includes not only the systems inside Myanmar, but also the systems that UN and other aid agencies are trying to create, just simply because they don't and cannot trust these systems. And we're no stranger to this as well in the United States, right? We have had historical trends in digital identity where we've used, not digital identity, but identity systems in the past that have been used to disenfranchise groups of people, whether that's African Americans or indigenous populations in our own country. But also, today I think it's worth mentioning how law enforcement, whether that's Border Patrol or the police force, are using tools like Clearview AI, which started scraping data very early on without necessarily, so they're leaning into the gaps in regulations and privacy controls, I would argue, and putting Americans at risk. So technology is neither good nor bad. Once you build it and once you implement it, it's not neutral either. It has an effect. It has effects, good effects, bad effects, sometimes a combination. And so we can't consider the technology itself neutral.
No, I think the technology itself is almost exclusively driven by implementation, driven by policies coming down from higher up the food chain, as it were. So I agree, it's there's all sorts of technologies. They've all got a bunch of pros and cons, but inherently not good or bad.
Right. So we continue to assert that, yes, yes, there are many benefits to digital identity, and governments may be, driven, or certain departments in governments may be driven by one or more of these ideas: economic growth, financial stability, election security, cybersecurity. All of those things are true. But if we don't have human rights at the keystone, upholding the whole system, it could all fall apart quite easily. So the paper that Mark and I have been writing, we're not the first to say these things. There have been a lot of amazing seminal works out there on good digital and legal identification principles. So in our paper, we've analyzed all of the major ones that we have identified so far. I'm sure you'll tell me there's another, actually, because that keeps happening. But so like World Economic Forum, the World Bank, ID 2020, there's some work by Consult Hyperion that was really good, looking at privacy themes. And then recently, the draft recommendations by the OECD, very worth a read that covers a lot of ground. What we've tried to do is look for the themes that cut across all of these documents and all of these sets of principles and lay those out, and also dig a little bit deeper into quite a few of them. And so that's what the rest of the talk is going to be about.
I was just going to say, before we go off that one,
yeah.
The OECD paper in particular, I would recommend a read of. It's not terribly long. It's very to the point, and I think my colleague Nat Sakamura read it and said he has nothing but praise for it. So I don't think we can say much more than that, but do go out there and give that one a read in particular.
Well worth it. I hope that quality remains in the final draft, because it's always, as Heather says, a bit risky quoting a draft, but it's a good one. So our first topic is really about human-centered design processes. And Nishant, you made me think a lot about that earlier today. I definitely include ethical and value-based decisions in my use of that term, but maybe I am wrong, and I want to talk more because I loved your talk. So this is about keeping humans at the center of design, making sure that we're designing for all humans, being inclusive about that, and offering people choice and control. No one size fits all.
One
sorry.
point on that one, Elizabeth, sorry, that I thought to mention was that the review of the NIST 863 draft that came out, that has shifted quite significantly into making sure that agencies do consider the impact on a wide range of communities as well. So that's worth calling out, I think.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. That comes up
props to the NIST team for that.
Props to the NIST team, absolutely. Yeah. And that's we're starting to see that in a lot more documents. There are a couple of different resources out there that I would point you to. One of the things we've tried to do is bring a lot of this literature together in our paper and cite some of the really good pieces. So one of them is this paper by DIAC and the Human Technology Foundation. It was good. It talked about the use of personas and really broad engagement with communities in designing and building identity systems, and also that recognition that not every system is going to fit for every person. And once again, second time today that I'm aware of, the Code of Conduct by Women in Identity. I think this is a really promising piece of work, and it's really at its early stages. But what I love about it, and why I think it's a critical complement to things like the DIAC and Human Technology Foundation paper, is because the personas are not generalized. These are real stories from real people, and it speaks to the importance of designing for those marginalized and most vulnerable populations. So I think that's where this really, really adds value to sort of the common approaches to human-centered design, which build on really kind of the 80-20 rule sometimes. And so I want to pause there and continue that conversation a little bit. So edge cases, I hate that term actually, but I think it's important for the point that we're about to make. And again, I want to quote Hank Marsman, who did a great talk at EIC, where he said that edge cases, they may be edge to the design, but they're central to our humanity. So who are we talking about when we talk about edge cases? We are talking about the billion people on the planet who don't have a birth record. We're talking about people like Okie, who was misclassified in Uganda. We're talking about Patricia Brown, who lost her foundational paper-based ID documents. We're talking about people who for whom the stakes are incredibly high. Survivors of domestic abuse, for example, they need systems where they can be confident that they're not going to be tracked. Right? I'm thinking now about the National Health Service in the UK. There was a time when sort of gaps in their design process really meant that individuals who had reported that their spouses were abusers, that information didn't flow through all of their authorization and identity systems and other systems really. And abusers were getting text messages about the healthcare appointments of their children. And so they knew exactly where to find both the children and the mother. So there are high stakes for this type of person. Anyone in witness protection, tiny population. But obviously identity systems are critical for these folks, because not only do they need to be able to rip and replace completely their identities.
Yeah, hands up if you are in witness protection, by the way.
Yeah, hands up. Good one. Not only do they need to be able to rip and replace their identities, but they also need to build a new one. And when I was looking for horror stories, actually, about people being sort of uncovered, raising their hand in the big conference room. No, not that. When I was looking for horror stories, I actually found horror stories about people in witness protection who ended up looking a lot more like no birth record, where the government kind of failed to provide them an adequate history that they could use to build a life around. And most of these people were just the children of witnesses. Folks in elder care. Ian Glazer spoke earlier today about the pain and terror of on behalf of systems. This is critically important. There are many people around the world who are playing caring roles, and for whom family members and others rely upon them. And we not only need to ensure that they're able to act on behalf of those individuals, but also that they can't be taken advantage of, and that fraud can't be committed and identities stolen. And finally, the effectively stateless population that we've already talked about. So again, just want to ram home this point. These These are large groups of people, and it's probably worth flipping this around and saying, if we can design systems that work for these complex, thorny, scary, fear-inducing scenarios, we're going to create systems that protect all of us. I know you had some more thoughts.
Maybe we need the 20/80 rule.
Yeah, the 20/80 rule.
Or whatever the percentage is, right? Maybe overestimating that. Yeah. I don't know.
So I think including these populations in our persona development and that lead to design requirements and rollout requirements right at the beginning is one of the crucial recommendations in our paper.
Just before we go off that one, Elizabeth, it feels to me a bit like the delivery programs that we've all been part of, I'm sure, in multitude of digital identity systems and wider technology systems start on, what is the minimum viable product for the largest community. So almost baked into our project delivery processes is exclusion.
Yeah, and then when one of these scenarios pops up, you need to kind of go and rip and replace because it actually it becomes too complicated what you've already built.
Yeah, and retrofitting for edge cases, I think, as you're probably all well aware, is a huge cost which is hidden by these processes of dealing with the easy stuff first. So,
absolutely. So that's all great, but this is hard. This is really, really hard, right? The term government it belies a ton of complexity that sits beneath the surface. So does the term identity. You've got different departments issuing IDs, consuming IDs, verifying IDs, authorizing access. And you've got these different departments at the local level, my local town hall, your local office, I don't know. And then you've got it at the jurisdictional level, whether that's a state or a county or a region. You've got it at the national level. This is complex. And then beyond that, you've also got folks who are in the government seeking to regulate this spaghetti mess, looking to make sure that privacy rights are upheld, that the economy is able to rely upon identity that is reliable and prevents illicit flows of money. It's complicated.
One metric I could share, actually, just to illustrate this, is I know that in Norwegian healthcare, which is undergoing quite a lot of work at the moment, so a country with 5.5 million people or so, their healthcare system is involving 18,000 legal entities.
18,000 legal entities.
For a country with 5 million people.
Yeah, so we're asking for something incredibly complex. Do you think that we should seek quick wins and just kind of avoid the complexity mark?
Yeah, that's obviously the best way.
That's obviously the way to do things.
So, strategy. Do I get the clicker now?
You can have the clicker.
Yeah, okay.
We're kind of shifting. I'll pipe in.
Yeah. Thank you. Keep me right. So from a technology perspective, we need to start from a very strategic position and take into account all of the challenges and the communities that Elizabeth has been talking to earlier. Function creep. There's a flip side to this one, which is adding features. Which is quite a matter of opinion. I think the critical thing about this one is actually being open and honest with the communities that you're dealing with. It's not function creep if they agree to it and everybody's above board about what's being done and why. Data proliferation, again, it's easier at times to proliferate the data, but that has consequences. Data getting left behind or having a greater attack surface, ultimately impacting on the privacy and confidentiality of people's data. Inappropriate market tools. So I think it's fair to say that in some implementations around the world, they've been vendor-led, and there's all sorts of reasons why that might be a bad thing. It could have resulted in lock-in, additional cost, inability to flex to deliver new features going forward, all sorts of reasons why market-led solutions may not be appropriate. It should be strategic and driven by what the outcomes you're looking for rather than the tooling available.
The really good example of that, or I think it's a really good example, you may disagree, but the Better Identity Coalition did a really good job of articulating how we came to depend in the US so much on knowledge-based authentication. And that was really because there was a market need for verification and no really good usable solution for service providers to rely upon. And so knowledge-based authentication sort of fit that gap. But actually, if we'd stopped to think about that, we might have realized that that's going to lead to a scenario where everybody knows where I went to preschool, especially these guys, and what make and model my first really crappy car was. And now all that data and more is kind of out there in the world.
And one day, Elizabeth, you might get to the point where you don't remember that car as well.
Absolutely. I mean, there are plenty of market-led solutions out there that rely on me remembering
all sorts of things.
Some random.
Yeah. And then there's the correlation side of things as well. We're all familiar with stories of how the various tech providers and potentially governments have misused data that's available to them. So there is a huge amount of complexity. We need independent oversight, transparency of all sorts of aspects of a delivery, accountability, collaboration between public and private sector. It's not something we've really touched on, but this isn't just about delivering a solution by government for government. In order to achieve the outcomes highlighted by the McKinsey report in terms of the increases in GDP, it needs to be something that spans across the private and public sector. There's the accessibility dimension. Clearly, one of the communities that could be excluded are people with special needs. Sustainability, so this stuff's going to be built now or soon. It needs to be persistent for quite a long time. We are talking decades. And then the environmental sustainability side of things is absolutely critical, given what's going on in the wider world too. I thought it was really interesting in this slide, though, not a single directly technology piece of complexity mentioned there. It's all policy and politics and those sorts of dimensions.
Yeah.
So we have tried to find a number of models or patterns that exist around the world for delivery of government human-centric identity, although they are often citizen-centric. There's a really highly successful in a lot of measures example in India from Aadhaar. I think it's the biggest digital identity system on the planet by far, with over 1 billion users and 90...
I mean, unless you count Facebook.
Yeah, maybe, okay. It's not a government one. A 90-something, I think it might be 99-point-something% population adoption of the eligible population. That one is really centralized. That's got a centralized data store, centralized identification and authentication services, and in particular the biometrics are all stored in the back-end databases effectively, with only the authorization then being passed out to other parties. Estonia is an exemplar that people use because of its longevity so far and its effectiveness for their population. That is more distributed, particularly with regard to the biometric authentication being done on device locally.
And it's I'm sorry.
Go on.
I just wanted to say, and these are intended to be exemplars. These are kind of design patterns that, and as Mark said, Estonia is representing a lot of different countries that have used a pretty similar architectural model.
Yeah. We weren't able to put every country that has a digital identity system on this slide, I'm afraid.
But we do have a later map.
Yeah. Then there's the distributed federation models. The critical difference in this one is that we have multiple identity providers available for either different purposes or to provide choice to the end users. Brokered federation, this one is a pattern that actually is a little bit out of date in the UK. I think it was only last month that the Verify system in the UK was formally declared a dead duck. But the pattern here was to have multiple identity providers passing the information via a hub provider to the endpoints needing the information, and that was in order to simplify a lot of the integration challenges. The pan-Canadian model.
This is the secure key model.
Oh, secure key, yeah.
Specifically.
So again, quite a similar pattern, except with identification being done by the ruling party end. And then the forthcoming EUID model, where we have identity issued by member states into a separate component that provides for authentication and the ability to present identity credentials, ultimately also handling things like the biometric authentication, and then passing that over to the authorization end.
I realize with people taking photos of this, I realize that I haven't stuck a source on here. This is This is building off of a report by Consult Hyperion. I want to give credit where credit is due.
Yes, we have tried to be rigorous in our citations in the
certainly
actual
in the
white paper.
but clearly oversight.
So yeah, I don't know if anybody from Consult Hyperion's in this room, but there's definitely at least one here at this event.
It's fine.
So from a governance model perspective, there's also a number of different patterns in evidence around the world. There's the very centralized public governance through effectively legislation and regulatory bodies. A couple of examples there would be the EU and India. There's a more distributed model where legislation is delivered that enables the development of private sector governance elements, and some of the work in Canada would be representative of that. In Norway, I believe the legislation is extremely lightweight, really just enabling that, and then the regulation, again, lightweight, with a lot of the policy around digital identity being handled by a legal entity. In this case, a legal entity majority owned by banks, so well-regulated environment. And then finally, some of the implementations in the US are almost exclusively private governance driven. Although I'm sure there are some federal and state laws that I wouldn't be aware of because I'm British.
Yeah, and there's definitely some, with the mobile driver's licenses work, there's definitely like a shift towards public-private partnerships. And I also do want to just call out, especially with the public governance piece, you have different manifestations of public governance, right? You have manifestations where the government has total oversight, but in some cases, the operator of the digital ID system is also the overseer and the regulator. And in other cases, you have an independent body. So there are typologies within this, but just broadly speaking, these are kind of the four models that we see out there in the world.
Here's our big map. I'm sure you probably can't read most of that, but on the left-right axis, we've got centralized governance models, centralized technology deployment on the left and decentralized deployment models on the right. And then the vertical axis was the entirely public governance at the top, private governance at the bottom, and the kind of intermediary levels in between. So we've dropped a number of different examples on here just by way of national flags to show where they fit on this graph. So we've got India and others over on the top left there with highly centralized technology solutions along with highly centralized public governance. We've got a number like Estonia where there is a little bit more distribution in the technology deployment, but still largely public sector governance model. Norway and Sweden are down there with distributed federation technical architecture and government-enabled governance, so oversight, but with a lot of private sector kind of definition and enforcement of the governance domain. UK and Canada are fairly, or at least one of the Canadian patterns we looked at, because there's another Canadian flag coming up in a minute, are public-private collaborative governance models and brokered federation model in the British case, and a credential service provider-based approach in Canada. And then on the far right here, where we have personal IDP, so a wallet would be a good example of that. The forthcoming eUID architecture, and was it Bhutan?
That's the Kingdom of Bhutan, yes.
Bhutan, yes, which is actually a remarkably similar architecture, both from a governance and technical perspective, to the European Digital Identity Programme work. Mm-hmm. And do you want to talk about the US?
Well, I think we were trying, so these are all different paradigms that we see, and we kind of looked at, what typifies each of these paradigms, and it's really important to note, as Mark alluded to in the topic of Canada, you may have multiple systems within one country, and that's certainly true of the US, where, kind of the mobile driver's licenses work is definitely far over on the right, where we're looking at wallets and personal IDPs. And the government is taking an active role, at least state government. And then on the far left, I don't want to name names, but we were able to identify at least one example of sort of a central biometric storage used in a government context. It may have been ripped out at some point, but to my knowledge, was purely privately governed.
Yeah. And the UK example is interesting. So that particular one is the verified gov.verify solution, which has expired. There are new systems emerging, which, while I think about it, one would be in the distributed federation left-right dimension, and one would be credential service provider. Mm-hmm. And I know that there's also early thinking going into the personal IDP-based approach as well in the UK. So there could be multiple technology architectures in that country. So one other thing that we tried to look at when we were looking at the architectural patterns was some sort of high-level view of which of these architectural patterns are best, and we looked at it through the lens of risk. There are clearly all sorts of risks associated with the delivery of digital identity systems, and with a fairly coarse brush, I have to say, we drew up a little spider diagram, and for me, what this shows is that for each one of the available patterns that we analysed, we came up with a graph with roughly the same area, which means when you add all the risks together, they're all roughly the same. They might be better in different dimensions, but overall, and as I say, with a coarse brush, there was not much between them, effectively.
Yeah, each of the architectures really grapples with mostly the same set of risks. If you listed them in order, you might find that one of them is more at risk of a PII breach than another, but the trade-offs are still the same across the board. And Nishant, I thought you did a really good job of articulating the trade-offs in any identity system. And all those trade-offs, regardless of the architecture you choose, will need to be balanced.
So, how are we doing for time? I should check. We've got actually only five minutes left, I think.
All right, well, let's go.
So we better motor on. So enforcement. There's a whole load of tools that we can use when mitigating these things. So there's various biometric protections, cryptography, data encryption practices, good standards, unique identifiers, so pseudonymous identifiers potentially, stateless hubs maybe, all sorts of technical and architectural tools that we can deploy to mitigate some of the risks.
Absolutely, and the rules are just as important, which makes the work that Nick does at the OIX absolutely critical in designing and rolling out these systems. We need fit-for-purpose data security laws, for one thing. We need fit-for-purpose privacy laws. We need trust framework development on top of that legislation. We'll dig into that in a moment. And then we need to enforce those things. We need not just the laws, but we need the enforcement practices, and transparent and preferably independent. Definitely independent. Strong should, independence.
Strong should. Yeah, so I should actually add, we went for strong should instead of must because we didn't feel it was our responsibility to tell governments what they must do. So, But
Strong should.
Elizabeth was pushing me on that one. Oh, okay. So emerging tech. Some of these risks that we are referring to may be mitigated by some of the emerging tech that we see at conferences like this. But I think there are potentially hidden risks there. So when a given solution becomes available, it's possible and sometimes, unfortunately, the case that there are hidden risks or unintended consequences of some of these things. So another dimension that we are talking about in the white paper is making sure that when we're selecting, when governments, I'm thinking of me as a government at that point, are selecting solutions, we do need to take into account the maturity of the technology components that we're choosing. Because if it's immature, then there could be hidden flaws that have not emerged and won't emerge until potentially the system has been deployed at scale.
Right. Can I borrow the clicker for this one?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. This has builds on it, this one. So in terms of institutional frameworks, I want to draw us back to the earlier conversation we were having on human rights law. And I also want to recommend this book, Beyond Data, which if any of you are on LinkedIn, like it's everywhere for me, but I follow Elizabeth Raniere's. And it's a really, really, really good book that talks to how we need a modern reinterpretation of human rights, given all of the advances in technology that may change the nature of them. So I think this is a really, really important step that we globally need to take. Another great book that I'll recommend that we cite in the paper is Breached by Solov and Hartzog. And this book, along with Beyond Data, really speaks to how legally we need to be redesigning and designing incentives for the best data security practices. You'll see that in NIS2 and in the Biden cybersecurity strategy and a number of others around the world. And then the incentive legally for great privacy protections, which you see in GDPR. Although I would argue, as Elizabeth Raniere argues in Beyond Data, that GDPR, even in its focus on consent and humans as data, could go further. On top of that, once you have these foundations of legal frameworks, you still need to take that into the digital identity realm and develop your trust framework. Again, I'll point to Nick at OIX here, and I'll also point to the great work at DIAC for developing a pan-Canadian trust framework. On top of that, each scheme, so we may have different schemes in different countries, each scheme needs rules and a way of governing those rules, and hopefully they draw directly from that trust framework. And then members of that scheme, the identity providers, the wallets, the relying parties, they all need to have contractual arrangements that determine, methods of enforcement that they adhere to all these best practices, and those contracts and everything beneath it needs to feed into the technical designs of each of their systems. So that's the tools that accompany the rules that accompany the tools.
So at the end of the day, I think some of our items of recommendation really are that things need to be sustainable and extensible. That's a kind of key recommendation. I'm sorry if this is really obvious stuff. It enables end users and business transactions. It's not something we've gone into a huge amount in the presentation today because there was only so much we could fit in. Cross-sector and critically cross-border. It's not just for us, the Globetrotters, but there are plenty of people who cross borders on a daily basis. And we need this stuff to be interoperable for their day-to-day needs. Mm-hmm. And in order to enable that, doing work to enable policy interoperability, not just technical interoperability, is really important too. It's all very well being able to present a credential in the US from the UK, but if nobody knows what it means, or that GPG level high is in some way equivalent to IL2, that would be useful, but it's not really something that's broadly accepted at the moment. It's not readily transferred at a policy level. So the net of all of this is, if you are involved in delivering a government digital identity project in any capacity, whether you're an employee of the state or you're a supplier or somewhere in between, Please come and support the standards bodies, the interoperability, the security benefits, the maturity of all of this sort of stuff, and the wide discourse about these systems, both in the technology and in the policy domain, will benefit you, I believe, and lead to much wider interoperability for systems going forward. And really don't leave it to your vendors. Their interests do not necessarily align to yours.
I mean, they can participate too, but it's worth you supporting your local standards body as well.
So, in summary, promote human rights, so we want a human-centered design process. Be strategic around your design and governance of the solutions that you choose to build. Enforce security and privacy by design, and test it. And proactively choose mature interoperable standards and help mature the ones that aren't mature yet if you need their features.
Yeah, if you see them as the thing that's going to enable your population to
enrich everybody or make the environment better.
And then invest in maturing those standards, absolutely.
Or help excluded communities to contribute. So yeah, I think that is pretty much it.
I don't know if we have time for questions, but I'm happy to take them until someone tells me to stop. Yes, hello.
I was just curious, because the UK is no longer in the EU, and you said that government verify is sort of down on the table, what direction do you anticipate them going? Following the EU standards anyway, or doing their own thing, or what?
So there is a digital identity and attributes trust framework in flight. It's not entirely finished yet, but it's very much a work in progress. It will enable the public-private sector collaborative policy domain to exist, and under that we expect various primarily private sector schemes to emerge. We're already seeing schemes that are focusing on particular use cases emerging. So there's a group around age verification emerging right now that springs to mind. There's also an identity system emerging delivered by the UK government themselves for access to government resources effectively. So it's a patchwork quilt at the moment in the forecast, but I also expect there'll be some consolidation over time, and there will need, I believe, to be interoperability with Europe and all sorts of other countries. So yeah, great question. Hopefully I answered it well. Cool. Any others? Yeah?
Where can I find the white paper?
It's not finished yet, I'm afraid. We are hoping to have a draft copy out for review in a matter of weeks.
Yes, we can share. We can talk to you. We can, I don't know, let you know when it is available to come out. Yeah. Hi.
In your talk, when you're referring to the stateless,
Yeah.
stateless group, does that include refugees?
Yeah. Oh well.
Because it's slightly different.
Yeah, it is different. So that's migration refugees. Yeah, yeah.
See the stateless one as just people choosing to, or like in a situation where they're moving, but in a refugee situation, sometimes the government's turn.
Yeah, I think there's an overlap, right? So some refugees are stateless people, some are not stateless people, and it's a broader category. Yeah, and you're right to call them out, and it's definitely not an edge case.
But I can say one of the people we did talk to was living in the house they'd always lived in. And due to war, essentially, their previous government had effectively abandoned them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So.
that's one of the reasons I was kind of calling out that edge case.
Yeah.
Because in certain conflicts or whatever, the government turns on their own population.
Yeah, absolutely.
Effectively, they disavow all the papers that establish it.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
absolutely.
mean, that's been the case for the Rohingya population in Myanmar as an example, and then the sort of border region between Turkey and Syria. I think there are a lot of people, I don't know whether you would call them stateless or refugees, and they're probably both.
One of the interesting suggestions that came out of that call, actually, we said, well, what do you think a good solution would be? And I think it was the person that we were talking to from Turkey/Syria, but also neither, was that perhaps UN-issued identity documents for those stateless people might be a really good way forward.
Exactly.
Any more for any more?
Really
Thank-
happy to chat if you want to come up afterwards.
Yeah, thanks for sticking with us.
Thank you.